After all the time, after you, did you see me with someone new? Hanging so high for your return, but the stillness is over. Had I seen it in your eyes, there'd have been no try after try. You're leaving and no goodbye. Had I just seen one in your eyes.
And I'm going to begin today. Oh, first of all, I'll tell you a few things about me as to maybe supplement what Damiano said. I am a professor of architecture. I've been associated with New School in San Diego for 25 years. I'm also a practicing architect, and I'm very interested always in the relationship between academia, school, and what happens within the profession. And I think my presentation is consistent with that interest in the similarities and the differences between the two. Before I begin this talk, I'm actually going to begin with a toy. All right, this is something called a tube, T-O-O-B, and a company in the States makes these things in all sorts, all types. The very first one was called Zoo Tube, and it was full of little plastic animals, a zebra, an elephant, a lion, the kinds of animals you would see at a zoo. So I was in a toy store not too long ago, and I noticed this tube, this new tube called Around the World. And because it was full of buildings, I bought it. Because being an architect, I'm interested really in buildings of any size. And what this is a little collection of famous buildings that the makers thought anyone would recognize from anywhere. So, of course, you've got the three pyramids here in ancient Egypt, and they're all interconnected. And here's, well, you know from your history classes, the Leaning Tower, and I'll just pull one more out, Taj Mahal. And so it's this little collection of famous buildings. Well, the designers of the tube had a challenge. They had to figure out what building they could put in the tube to represent the 20th century, because everything else is older. The most recent piece would be the Eiffel Tower, of course, from 1889. So those designers had to come up with something that would represent modern times. One thing, this only holds 10 of these little pieces, one thing to represent from all the possibilities architecture of our time. And what do you suppose they picked? Any ideas? Yeah, you're right, you're on me there. Yes, it had to be a tall building. In fact, it's the Empire State Building in New York City. And this is interesting to me. I study architectural criticism. I'm interested not only in what architects and students of architecture think about architecture. I'm particularly interested in what the public, the people outside of architecture, think about architecture. So to me, this is significant. Because this toy is obviously for any child. And yet, it shows the significance of this kind of building, of skyscrapers, tall buildings, that is what would be selected to represent the last 100 years or so in architecture for someone interested in playing with a toy like this. So today I'm going to talk about my research into criticism. It's been primarily focused in the United States, but I'm interested in areas beyond that. I'm certainly interested in your own thoughts about architecture, about tall buildings, about architectural curriculum in general. And here we have a skyline of San Diego. This is what it looks like from San Diego Bay. This is a student project added in Photoshop into that skyline, proposing a vertical farm, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit farther on. And the strange thing is, San Diego is maybe an unlikely place for someone truly interested in tall buildings. We have a few, none of them terribly tall. Our tallest building at about 152 meters is just about half of what a super tall building is. Are you familiar with that phrase, super tall? Those are buildings now over 300 meters, over about 1,000 feet by our measurement. And we don't have any of those. We don't have anything close to that. And they're a combination of reasons. We have very poor soil, so building in San Diego is challenging because the soil isn't very good. We don't have good rock as they do in Manhattan for tall buildings like this, where there's a layer of granite just below the earth. We have earthquakes. We're in what they call a very active seismic zone. Earthquakes can happen at any time, some can be significant. And our downtown is also right next to our airport. So we can't build over a certain height because planes fly in right through the downtown. It's an exciting thing when you're on an airplane, because you fly right through the downtown, but it means we can't build over a certain height. So there are a number of reasons why San Diego does not have really tall buildings. It doesn't have a lot of tall buildings anyhow for its size. Nonetheless, we're still interested in them. And architects, students, the public, all are interested in what's going on with tall buildings. And whenever a tall building gets added to the skyline, there's a lot of attention paid to it. And to me, this is one of the significant things about skyscrapers. Because they become part of an urban skyline, we pay particular attention to them. We really want to know what they look like, and often people have a very strong reaction to them. And those are the sorts of things I'm interested in studying. And so this presentation is about criticism. It's actually in two parts. The first part is about architectural criticism and the development of contemporary high-rises. And then a second part that's really speculating on where I think tall building design might go in the very near future. The critic John King writes architectural criticism in San Francisco, and he made a point after the events in New York of September 2011 and the destruction of the World Trade Center that everything's different. John King felt everything was going to change, and certainly a lot of people did. And indeed, many things did change. Asia, the Middle East became the real laboratories for cutting-edge tall building design, and it shifted that focus away from the United States, which had been the leaders in that sphere of architecture for many, many years. At the same time, computers have changed everything, just as they have in so many different facets of life. I've listed a few things. New software, sophisticated programs that allow us to calculate and achieve an amazing variety of forms. New materials that are made possible and now applied to tall buildings that make them lighter and stronger. Even new methods of fabrication, so we can customize parts for tall buildings and do this at a large scale in a way that's affordable. These are attributes of the digital age that did not exist a generation or two ago, and they have indeed changed things. At the same time, some things haven't changed. There is still a debate amongst critics about the merits of tall building, and particularly building skyscrapers in dense urban environments. Is it the right thing to do? Does it make for a more habitable place? There is still the economics of the situation. These are tremendously expensive buildings, and the limitations of the economics continue to be a challenge for architects, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There was also the sense, the fear, that because of the events surrounding September 2011, tall buildings would be a kind of target for terrorists. And of course, as we found out, happily that has not been the case. Looking back at it, in fact, another American critic, the Chicago writer Blair Kamen, has said self-inflicted damage from an overreaction to the terrorist threat has been particularly lamentable. He thought it was going too far, and it was stifling creativity because we were worrying about things that did not come to pass. So it's a mix. Yes, some things have changed, but maybe not everything that John King proposed would change. So it's a paradoxical situation. And what I want to explore in the next few slides is where that leaves us. The writer Ada Louise Huxtable, longtime critic of the New York Times, defined the development of the skyscraper, the history of this type, through 4 phases. And she said, to understand the tall building, you have to understand it in terms of functional, eclectic, modern, and postmodern phases. I think we've long since passed that 4th postmodern phase, and we're in a 5th phase that, for me, involves a new kind of functional development, but with a very different kind of perspective to it. I think where Huxtable said in the first phase, architecture was the servant of engineering. That is, engineering really determined the form of buildings and their overall shape, such as one of Sullivan's early buildings, the Gage in Chicago. Now I think the reverse is happening. Architects are directing engineering to create some of the fantastic forms that are happening now. And this is what I call the spectacle of the technical. And remember, I'm interested in this from the point of view of criticism and what writers are saying about architecture and how the public's responding. I think Huxtable's first phase has really been replaced by something quite different. And there is, at least momentarily, a deep fascination with the technology of tall buildings. There's an interest in the impact of that technology on high-rises and on us, how we respond to tall buildings. There's a kind of wonderment in current criticism that I see that acknowledges the presence of spectacle in skyscraper design today. And I'm going to define how I use the word spectacle in the next slide. And incidentally, I want to stress that this is a discussion that in the States isn't limited to professionals. This is something many, many people in different areas speak about. The writer Wes Jones has made a distinction between 2 attributes in architecture today. One he calls sensation, which is about the senses, about the emotional impact of architecture, versus what he calls sense, which is the brain part, the intellectual aspect of architecture. And I think there's always been this kind of dualism, this kind of conflict between the senses, the emotions, and the brain, but we see it particularly in tall buildings today. And a number of writers have begun to make this connection between architecture and a new global economy and this idea of spectacle. One writer, Luis Fernandez Galeano, calls it architainment. It's a combination of architecture and entertainment. architecture is a commodity. It's something that we can buy. And when you begin to think about buildings as substantial and significant as they are, as a commodity, this encourages speculation. This encourages the idea that buildings are something that can be bought and sold, about image being very important in architecture, maybe to a degree we haven't seen before. No one's had more of an influence in this line of thought than this architect, of course, Rem Koolhaas. And his interest has been not only in programming or novel form or the size of buildings, but even the rhetoric behind them. And I like this quote of his: "I want to kill the traditional idea of the skyscraper. It has run out of energy." And he uses that to explain the ideas behind his tower in Beijing. It's this idea of sensation that gives spectacle material form. Writers Musavi and Kubo say that buildings relate to contemporary architecture, in fact, through creating sensation, or what they call building expressions. And they argue that whereas in the previous phase, postmodernism was about a kind of decor, something added to architecture so that it had a means to symbolize something and to communicate. And now the situation is very different. And so we have a focus on appearances, a focus particularly on the skin of the building as the place for this kind of visual appeal that somehow they argue has to do with culture. Along with sensation is a related notion which we call effect. One writer, one critic has defined this, I think pretty clearly, as the impression made on the senses through the effects of material, light, color, reflection, and presumably pattern. So things we look at are part of this vocabulary of effects which reinforces this idea of sensation. And in fact, in Musavi and Kubo's book, Function of Ornament, which is kind of a catalog of effects, everything from what they call the dematerialized to the cinematic, there are examples of two tall buildings. This is one of them, Norman Foster's St. Mariac's tall building and Jean Nouvel's in Barcelona. So they clearly include the tall building in this investigation of sensation and effect and how the skin of buildings impacts architecture today. Critics reinforce this preoccupation, and as you read architectural criticism, you notice it in the writing. You notice this interest in the idea of sensation. For instance, Blair Kamen, I mentioned him earlier, the Chicago critic, writing about this building, the Burj Khalifa, begins with the sustainability argument, because this is an emphasis of his. And I'll quote him here: "When sustainability supposedly has supplanted spectacle as architecture's guiding principle, the bling of the Burj Khalifa offers a convenient target." And then he goes into really talking about aspects of the building: the height, the tremendous height of this thing, the form of it, aspects of the skin of the building. And so while he starts with sustainability, where he ends is with sensation. That's his focus, that's his interest, that's what he thinks is truly remarkable about a building like this. New York Times critic Nikolai Urasov, writing about Frank Gehry's tall tower in New York City, this is Spruce Street, his first high-rise residential building, really focuses his own review on this rumpled metal skin, on the process of fabrication that made it possible, on 10,000 stainless steel panels, every one of them different. Clearly a different approach to design than was economically feasible before the digital age. And these are the things that a critic like Urasov really wants to talk about. It's the sensation, it's the spectacle of the building. It's not about the program, it's not about the siting of the building, it's about appearances and the technological processes that allow Gary to conceive a building like that and for it to get built. So I've seen in the review of criticism quite a bit of consistency in where the interests of architectural critics go. And in my research, where the critics go, the public often follows. There are other examples of literature that reinforce this fascination with the spectacle of the technical. You may be familiar with this publication called Evolo, whose editor, Carlos Aiello, sponsors design competitions for something he calls the skyscraper for the 21st century. He identifies three approaches. I've listed them here. Morphogenetic experimentation, that is, form experiment that thinks genetically, thinks in terms of living processes as a kind of inspiration for architecture. Secondly, morphotectonics. Here, the emphasis really on the technology of tall buildings and how that can change them. And the third category, sort of where he puts everything else, which he simply calls conceptual. And it's a wide-ranging discussion. All of these, though, involve digital manipulation. They involve almost obsessive technological narratives. Here's one example from the 2006 competition called Genom Tower 05. And I won't read the quote that talks about the development of the form, but it's really about process. It's about experimenting with new ways to make buildings. I'm not even sure anything close to this form could actually be made. What's significant, though, is people are thinking this way in the design and creation of tall building projects. I see four themes developing around this spectacle of the technical, and I'll talk about each of these in turn. The first is extreme forms of iconography. Secondly, structural daring. Third is materiality, and the fourth is called change and adaptation. The first of these, forms of iconography, it's not about cultural relevance, it's about spectacle. Here is the tall building in Chicago by Studio Gang, Chicago architects, which owes its overall exterior form, according to its designer Jeannie Gang, to the landscape of the rock formations she sees in this part of the American Midwest. Now, there may be some kind of a cultural association there, but what I think is most significant is the kind of a visual effect that's created by this kind of vertical topography. That's really what she's interested in exploiting in this project. Secondly, the idea of structural daring. Here again, Koolhaas's CCTV project under construction. And clearly he was interested in doing something that seemed contrary from a structural point of view. This is not the easiest way by any means to design a building. And I really like his quote. This is talking about Ova Arab and Partners as structural consultants. I was elated and horrified by the sheer outrage of the problem that we had set them. Why did they never say no? So here's one of these cases where the architects are challenging the engineers to try to find ways to realize structurally the forms that architects are coming up with. And so much of this, I think, in both the architecture and the engineering behind it, really is about this idea of spectacle as a significant aspect of tall buildings today. Next is materiality. That aspect of buildings that I think is consistent with recent ideas of phenomenology as expressed by architects such as Juhani Plasma and other movements that value a sense of tactility, the ability to understand buildings in other than visual terms. But for an audience looking at high-rise buildings and for designers faced with the challenges of building tall, it's not so much about the feeling of the building, but the sense you get that there is a kind of texture to it. Here's an example by Bernard Schumi in New York City. It's all glass, but it's about a pattern that develops and his interest in creating something that almost feels tactile. I think the other example that I illustrated that expresses materiality would be Frank Gehry's building in New York City as well. We want to sort of touch it and understand the rippling of that facade. Let's go on to the next. Lastly, this fascination with buildings that move or change is something we see in much new work. This is, I would say, an extreme example. It's from one of the skyscraper competitions. It's actually called Flyscraper. And the idea is everyone lives in one of these deployable pods. They're connected by a kind of lifeline, but you can fly this thing out into space and park it in space, and that's your own version of a tall building. It's an outrageous example. It's taking the idea of a tall building to the extreme. Maybe it's not even a tall building. But what's of interest to me is an architect's fascination with the technology that would make this kind of thing even remotely possible. I think that's a different emphasis, a different phase in skyscraper design than we've really ever seen, perhaps since the very beginning at the end of the 19th century. One other thing I want to mention here is a tendency towards what one critic calls biomorality. And this is related to the issue of sustainability in architecture. Success is defined in this concept in biological terms. Being biological means being sustainable, which means being successful. And so if sustainability makes us feel good about ourselves, we're helping preserve materials, we're helping live more responsibly on the earth, it's a good thing. It has a moral component to it. And we see that in some of these extreme examples of this idea of biomorality. So clearly something different is happening in the world of high-rise design. Some critics, the British critic Peter Buchanan, see the existence of tall buildings really tied completely to sustainability. We have to find ways to make them sustainable and efficient, otherwise they will no longer exist. And there is much disagreement with Buchanan's point of view. Density and the efficiency we get from density helps us understand why some buildings become as tall as they do. I think the sustainability issue is still a phenomenon waiting to happen. Also, in the rapid rise of Asian economies and the development of tall buildings in places like Dubai, that has grown so quickly, any interest in evolving local concepts of symbolism and iconography really have not happened either. And currently the focus is elsewhere. I think the general public, where I see it, the consumers of buildings and everything else, want to be entertained by tall buildings. I think this drives much of the current attitude. And I quote a Toronto professor, Andrew Payne, who says, "Current appeals to pleasure, effect, and sensation are key to both a desire to re-engage the aesthetic dimensions of architecture and its experience, and a very developed aversion to the conceptual frameworks that have guided modernist and neo-modernist discussions." So people want to look at buildings that entertain them, that dazzle them, that cause them to wonder how they got built. So from a critical point of view, what do we make of this? Well, I think, like many things, there's both good and bad. On the negative side, I think spectacle is a kind of distraction from the deeper debates we need to have about the necessity or even the value of tall buildings. I think unfortunate also is an unwillingness to address the idea of symbolism. Here are buildings that, because of their size, their prominence, become symbols whether we intend them to or not, and I think this is something we need to talk more about. The Chinese want buildings that look like buildings in the West. Who are we to say no to that idea, even though we may sense that's not the right kind of architecture, not the appropriate kind of expression for a very different culture and a very different context. Nonetheless, it's happening. On the other hand, I think there is some positive in this idea of spectacle. First of all, the emphasis, the interest in effect isn't going to last too long. It's like having too much of a good thing. At some point, we're going to get tired of all this kind of stuff and demand buildings that are more rigorous, perhaps more disciplined, and begin to relate to things. I think, though, also on the positive side, the fascination with tall buildings and tall building projects shows us that people do care. They're interested. They want to know about these things. There are television programs about tall buildings, and the public watches them. I think they allow us architects to put our skills on display in a very unique kind of way. A tall building is a difficult challenge, and it's an opportunity for architects to demonstrate their skills, demonstrate their training in an intense kind of way. And I think for a profession that often struggles with the pressures of development, with being marginalized by the building industry that often wants to start to take over what it is we do, I think this is good news because it continues to reinforce the importance and value of architects in society. So let's talk for a few minutes about what is next, and I'm going to propose a few ideas here. Here, in fact, is my tall building studio in San Diego, where the idea was to respond to those themes of materiality, structural bearing, and so forth, in beginning first concepts of a tall building here for a site actually not far from our school in the downtown area. But recent thinking about tall buildings, I think, suggests that spectacle is going to move in a new direction, and that's what I want to focus on here. And you may ask what could happen beyond the idea of spectacle. What could be more spectacular? I think it has to do with the program, the function of tall buildings themselves. And before I talk about that, I want to set a little bit of a historical context. So I'm going to go back a couple minutes. One of the things that I think is appealing about tall buildings, here's another Louis Sullivan example, is that it's a very clearly and clearly defined type and a very limited kind of one. It's straightforward. Typically, it's been consistent programmatically. It's either commercial or it's residential. The program is relatively consistent from one floor to the next, just as Sullivan argued over a century ago. The basic elements of the tall building are absolutely simple and minimal. There's a core, there is the leasable space around the core, there is the skin, and there's the structure. 4 elements to study, and you begin to have a good idea about the constituent parts of skyscrapers. The most important American critic writing in Sullivan's time, a man named Montgomery Schuyler, said of his buildings, I don't think it was of the Wainwright in particular, Schuyler said Sullivan's buildings were no uglier than they had to be. He recognized the fact that this was something very different in the 1890s for which we didn't have a precedent, and if the proportions of the sizes of them were disturbing to people, that was okay because it was the start of something new, and he understood that. The limitations of the type have been problematic for other architects. 2 examples, of course, from Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright understood this from the very beginning, that there were tremendous economic pressures on tall buildings, there were tremendous structural challenges, And those would limit creativity. And so when we think about his long career and the hundreds of buildings designed and built to Frank Lloyd Wright's design, it's remarkable that there are only 2 tall buildings, and they're not even that tall. This is one of them, the research laboratory at the Johnson Wax Company in the Midwest. The second, the Price Tower in the state of Oklahoma. Both of them what we would now call sort of low-rise, mid-rise kinds of buildings. Where he speculated, where he dreamed about tall buildings, it was a very different case. Here's the mile-high skyscraper. This, if built, would be twice as tall as the Burj Khalifa. Clearly not a building that could be realized in 1957 when he designed it. It was an idea. It was a thought. It was a speculation, not intended to be realized. And so the point I want to make here is that an architect of this ability found the tall building so problematic, so constricted by technology and economics, that he really didn't pursue a career designing. Another issue architects have had with tall buildings is what I call the fantasy problem. And here's an example, the Tribune Tower in Chicago. These relate to Huxtable's second phase, the eclectic phase, or the strange phase of building design. And yet this is the great romantic period in architectural history for skyscraper developments, the period of the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the Tribune Tower, and many others that borrow on historical motifs, that propose historically recognized forms, although in great vertical height. And these are buildings that are tremendously popular with the public. There is something about them that resonates with non-architects that have made this phase in architecture particularly interesting. Lastly, the third thing that I think has proven to be a disruption to the skyscraper story is the fact that buildings like the Tribune Tower aren't part of the modernist narrative. They're a disruption in that narrative. What I've illustrated here are the 2 tall buildings illustrated in the catalog for the International Style Show of 1932, the catalog for the exhibit from which the phrase international style developed. And only 2 tall buildings of all the possibilities at the time that the exhibit designers felt were appropriate to the to contemporary architecture to include in New York, the McGraw-Hill Building and the PSFS Building in Philadelphia. So at the same time, the Empire State Building is being completed, the Chrysler Building is being completed. These 2 examples that are consistent with modernism completed as well. And so, for those interested in promoting the international style in a kind of consistent vocabulary of design, it was hard to reconcile something like the form of the Chrysler Building or the Tribune Building. Where did it fit in the zeitgeist? Where did that fit in the history of 20th century architecture? And so we see through the development of this type, and it's a relatively short history, it goes back now not quite 150 years, some disruptions, some changes along the way. And I think those help explain why the history of tall building hasn't been consistent, why we see the new developments we see today. Buildings that relate to their context, at least in any definitive close way, are still relatively rare. The cultural challenges of building tall are still relatively few and far between. Most tall buildings seem like they could fit just about anywhere. Skyscraper designers from the West take their work to places like China and build things very similar to what they might build in Europe or in the States or elsewhere. They don't look to cultural models, and the perception is cultural models don't have anything to say to a landscape that begins to be populated with buildings of this kind of form.
Thanks. And regional solutions that has something to do with local context in certain ways are rare, except for the occasional example, Ken Yang's building in Malaysia, the Menara Masiniaga, which is related to the climate of the area. There are new buildings now being developed to take advantage of wind energy, since there's so much turbulence created by buildings this big, and yet these are still a rarity. We don't see a significant increase in development of architecture along these lines as well. So I think where new buildings will start to go is towards being creative about their programming. The problems of the city are still going to preoccupy architects as cities become bigger and denser. There's an opportunity for tall buildings to respond to the pressures of urbanization. How we live in them is going to change. Society's becoming, in many places, more affluent. Think of Bjarke Ingels' group, and they're saying yes is more. And I think tall buildings have a place in this new urban society. I think creative programming can change the tall building. Leisure lifestyle becomes an important part of architecture in the city. Some notable architects like Bjarke Ingels or Winnie Moss argued that leisure and sustainability are not incompatible. They should exist together. And further, that leisure itself is a productive activity. And I think these hold clues to what we might see tall buildings start to evolve into. If we can join spectacle, if we can join sustainability and leisure, it's possible that something very different will happen over the next generation. And so I argue that the next phase for tall buildings is something I call spectacular programming. Unusual programs are not new to tall buildings, but the scale of application will be something very different. If we've got indoor skiing in the desert, if we have wave machines making surfers miles from the beach, why not begin to try some truly audacious things with tall buildings? And I think what we'll begin to see are functions that seemingly would be resistant to verticality, to being put up in the air. Here's an example from one of my students when we asked them to speculate. It's called Tony Hawk's Tower. The student's a skateboarder. He's interested in the skateboarding star Tony Hawk. And so the center of this building becomes a vertical skateboard park, ringed by residential units. Is it plausible, feasible to do right now? No, probably not, but it's not too far off. We see other examples too. Here is a vertical cemetery proposed for terrace. Vertical gardens, vertical zoos, things we don't associate with going up, we associate with spreading out. And I think these examples, as intriguing as they are, have the scale, have the program to begin to change how we think about the city, how we think about tall buildings, and give us the chance to move in a new direction with the tall building, to rethink what happens with our cities, and if we do this correctly, make new cities sustainable, truly sustainable for the benefit of the planet. Thanks very much.
As if lost